Hello, my name is Michael Newert. I'm an EMF test engineer and I've been testing and reducing electromagnetic fields since 1992. This is a video about how to use the Acoustimeter AM10. And this first part is just a quick entry for beginners. Fairly simple meter. No meter is perfect, but I like this one for a lot of its features. To turn it on is actually fairly simple. There's a little slider to turn on, and we have numbers up here now, if you can see that. Yeah, this is the numbers, and this is a very low field environment, so we're not seeing these LEDs light up very much yet. But as a beginner, what you're going to use mostly is the LEDs when they light up, and you'll see two columns. One on the left here is called peak, one on the right is called average, and we're usually going to use the peak. That's the one we're most interested in. Later in this video we'll go over why we use peak. So often you'll be using these LEDs and you'll see numbers 0.02 up to 6.00. So you can kind of watch the LEDs as they light up. There's also a feature on this meter for sound where it makes an audio replication of the radio frequency, and there's a volume control here. You can see that on the side. You can turn it up and down, so if you don't want to hear it, you turn it off. Or if you want to hear it, to turn it up. Later we'll get into how to use that to identify the kind of radio frequency fields that you have. And of course with a meter like this you have to make sure that you have good batteries. Right now this is good. If this was a low battery situation, somewhere here you'd see low battery lit up. And also this meter will sometimes, when it's getting low, make three tones like to kind of tell you that your battery's running low. If you need to change the batteries, it's pretty simple. You go to the back of the meter here, take off the bottom cover, and you put in two new AA batteries. Very simple. And then to take a measurement, well, again, maybe I'll just show you this one more time. When you first turn this meter on, you'll see those LEDs go up and down. That coloring, I'll do that again. See the LEDs go up and down like that. That is just an indication that everything is working. When you see those LEDs at the beginning, do that initialization, we know that the meter is working properly. How to take a peak measurement. There are several different kinds of measurements you can do with your acoustic meter, and the most important one will be the peak measurement. Again, if we look at the meter, a little close up here, you'll see that the LEDs on the left are labeled peak and the ones on the right are average. We're talking about peak here. There's also, the LEDs are often good enough for getting some idea what's going on. We actually also, if you want to know more exactly what number you have, in this upper display here, there's actually three numbers that you're given. And the number we're looking for peak levels is in the upper right. In this case right now it's saying less than 0.02 volts per meter. If we had some higher fields here, you would see a different number there, pretty much corresponding to these peak LEDs. And that's, in this instant, it's telling us what's the level of the electromagnetic fields, the radio frequency fields, at this very moment. So that'll change. That number in the upper right is the one that'll change when things go higher and lower for the peak. And if we wanted to take a measurement right now, we'd look at it. We see no LEDs lit up, so we know that we're less than 0.02 on the meter. And we can also look up here, it says less than 0.02 volts per meter. This is a relatively low level. Most environments will have more than this, but this would be ideal to have this low level. How to take a max peak measurement. There's another kind of measurement that you can take with your Acoustimeter AM10. And there's a couple different names for it. We might call it max peak or peak hold. What it means is, when you first turn your meter on, and your meter up here in the upper right is recording what's the peak level at this moment, which could go up and down. We'll show you later some higher levels when we create a source here. On the left in the upper row there's another number, and it says 0.02. That is like a holding the highest peak that it's measured since we turned the meter on. So if this had gone up to 0.03 on the right, it would hold 0.03 on the left over here even as 0.02 as this changes on the right. So that's something that'll, the one on the right will vary with the moment, and the one on the left will keep that peak that's the maximum it's seen since the meter is turned on. So a couple of ways that you can use that, you can do a sweep of the room. You can go through the room and take a look. Maybe you saw a few LEDs go on, and then you could take a look and look up here on the left, and whatever the highest was. In this case, it's fairly quiet right now. Get that in the focus. And we've had only 0.02, actually less than 0.02 is all we've measured so far. So that tells me when I just did that little sweep, we had nothing higher than 0.02. That max peak level can be really helpful for measuring the whole room. It's also another thing about this kind of meter, it's what we call a single axis meter. So sometimes the radio frequencies are stronger in one direction than another. You actually have to move the meter around a little bit to make sure you've caught the highest direction. And if I did that right here, and now I look at what's that max peak, the upper left there, 0.05. So lo and behold, let's see if we can get that in there a little bit. You can see that 0.05 on the upper left. That's the maximum it's seen when I was twisting it around. So that tells me, that's an important number. That's the maximum peak that I did for that little test right there. How to use the special audio function on your Acoustimeter AM10. Perhaps one of the most helpful features of a meter like this is its sound function, this audio function. A couple of reasons for that. One is, on this kind of meter, it's a very sensitive function. So it'll give you audio sounds of radio frequency fields that are below the level that are registering on your meter with the numbers and the LEDs. So for sensitive people, this can be really helpful. You can still find sources that are actually quite low because of the sensitivity of the sound function. It's also very helpful because the sound of the RF, and I'll explain in a minute how that even makes a sound, are distinctive. So you can tell a cell phone from a cell tower, from a Wi-Fi router, from a smart meter. They all have different distinctive sound patterns that you'll hear on your meter. And you can learn those patterns. Like if you want to learn what a cell tower sounds like, just take your Acoustimeter up to a nearby a cell tower you know that's there, and it'll be very clear what it is. Basically how the sound function works on this is most of these radio frequencies in our modern world now are digital frequencies, and the way this digital is done is they're actually pulsed on and off, often 100 times, 200 times a second, and that pulsing on and off is a frequency of pulsing in the range that our ears can hear. So the meter just takes the pulsing frequency of the much higher frequency, radio frequency signal that's out there, and turns that into a sound for you. And you basically hear this modulation of the signal. We'll show you in a second. I'm going to turn this on. And right now, if you take a look, we're still at very low levels. There's no LEDs lit up, and we have 0.02 up at the top line there for both the peak and the maximum peak. And yet you can hear something. I'm going to turn this around a little bit. Make sure you hear that. It's kind of a high frequency. There's a couple things in there. I'm going to turn it around a little, try to catch. You can hear I'm turning it around, almost have it. Sometimes I can catch my neighbor's Wi-Fi router. I'll hear the beacon rate of his router. Right now, that sound that you're hearing, that's mostly cell tower. There's a cell tower that went in about a year and a half ago that at the nearby athletic field for the high school. And it's not a very high level. Again, you don't see it registering here, but it's definitely there, and the sound functioning is picking it up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn on another source, because you can see right now it's a low level and you can hear that sound. I know there's a cell tower in the background somewhere. And in a few seconds, all of a sudden you're going to see these LEDs light up and you're going to hear a new sound, which in this case is going to be from a router that we just turned on. It's a relatively low-powered router. And it'll give a distinctive kind of a ch-ch-ch-ch-ch, which the beacon rate for a lot of routers is a very distinctive kind of sound. You can also Smart meters will have another kind of sound. Oh, there it goes. You can see that now we're registering on the LEDs here. It's a stronger signal because it's close to us. And you can hear, I'm going to turn around so you can hear that. And that's a pretty distinctive sound for a Wi-Fi router. Now, if we wanted to confirm that it was a Wi-Fi router, one thing we could do is unplug that. Would you unplug that for a second? Thank you. And all of a sudden that goes away. And now you can tell there's still that cell tower screeching in the background, but that that chopping just went away. And that's one of the ways we could even confirm that indeed that was that little Wi-Fi router that was making that signal. That's very helpful. One of the most helpful things about this sound function is not only that you can start to figure out what the source might be. Oh, that sounds like a cell tower. Oh, that sounds like a decked phone. These all have different distinctive sounds. But then you can unplug the decked phone or unplug the router and see if that sound goes away, and it confirms to you right there that that was the source. Very helpful feature, the audio function on the Acoustimeter. Tips for better accuracy and using a data form. So one of the things about taking measurements with any kind of meter, including the Acoustimeter, is how do you do it in a way that you get your best measurements? Because the way you take the measurements can influence whether you're getting really a good, accurate representation of the fields or not. So a couple things. Since this is a single axis meter, it's necessary to move the meter around. If I just hold it in one position, I'm going to turn it on here again. If I hold it in one position, like flat like this, I may pick up certain radio frequency fields in the right direction, and I might miss some going in another direction. So just to make sure, we want to twist it around a little bit. I'm watching the LEDs. Indoors, often this isn't as important because the radio frequencies that come in from other places are bouncing off all the various walls, and all the directions are getting mixed up. But what often happens if you're outside, say, and you're trying to measure a cell tower, those signals are less distorted and reflected by surfaces nearby. So sometimes those are more directional and you have to play with the meter a little bit more, but always do that to make sure you're not missing it. So number one is you just want to twist the meter around, make sure that you're not missing the strongest field strength, because in some ways what you really want is what's the strongest I measure. Another way that can be really important is you could take a measurement right at this spot where I'm in this family room, and it might be a little different measurement over to my right at the computer or over on this couch here. So one of the things you can do, and this is where it's helpful to use that maximum peak function, which is in the upper left on the display here. With the meter on, you can just sweep it around. And we can take a measurement over here. I'm sweeping it around over at this chair where people might sit, over at this computer. So far I'm not picking up anything. It's staying fairly low. And we're really concerned, probably especially where people sit the most, like this couch here, watching TV. Come over to this couch, I'm not picking up any LEDs right here. So this sweep function is really important, or the process of sweeping around to make sure that you are picking up fields that might be concentrated in one area or another. It can happen in rooms. Sometimes a field comes in the window and concentrates on one end of the room and a little less on the other. So you always want to check around the whole room, and especially want to check the places where people spend the most time, like on a couch like this. Like, we don't really care if over at that window it's 6 volts per meter, a relatively high level, but we would care if whatever level we have on the couch over here. Another thing for getting kind of more meaningful measurements is things can change. Like sometimes you'll have certain level of RF at one time of day, maybe because that's when the neighbor is using their cell phone in their backyard next to your bedroom window or something. The levels can change, things can change, even who's using iPads or things in your house. So another thing you want to do is take measurements at different times of day, and just and so you don't assume, this is a really clean room, I don't have any fields. Maybe that was at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Try 9 a.m. on Monday and see if it's the same thing. Take more measurements, repeat the measurements to kind of see the consistency of your measurements. And then the fourth thing for accuracy is it's very easy for us to mix up these numbers in our head. There's so many numbers. You measured the couch, and then you measured the chair, and then the computer, and then you also maybe measured some other type of field like magnetic fields, and you're starting to get all the numbers mixed up. So a very important thing is to use a data form. Once you have a form, it's actually fairly simple. You could just use any sheet of paper or get one from us. You can focus in there all right. This data form happens to have a column for magnetic fields, electric fields, and then I have two columns for radio frequency fields. And the reason I do that is I sometimes want to know when I'm looking at my meter. I already took some measurements in the master bedroom, and in the master bedroom I was typically getting measurements of 0.02, very less than even that, less than 0.02 on the Acoustimeter. Every once in a while there's a little spike, and so over here I put peak, and I should really say maximum, right in maximum, the maximum peak 0.003. So even though most of the time I was getting 0.02, I just made a note that, oh, there's a high peak there, because these things change a lot. So that's why I have two columns. And also, you want to make sure that you record what kind of units you're using. I've written in volts per meter up here, and the reason I do that is because there's all these different types of measurement units. It's kind of confusing. European units, American units, these volts per meter are another type of unit for radio frequencies, and you have to be really careful. I've had people say, my level is 1, is that good or bad? And that 1 in one type of unit could be 10,000 in another type of unit, so it doesn't tell me much unless I know what the measurement units are. We're looking at, with the Acoustimeter, we're usually looking at the peak, and it's over here where it says volts per meter. You see a V over M, V/M, that stands for volts per meter. That's the standard unit that this meter uses. It's not the most common measurement used by most other meters, but that's what this one uses. So just be aware of that if you're talking to other people and saying, oh, I had a measurement of, like on my meter, 0.10, you have to actually say 0.10 volts per meter, because they might think you're saying 0.10 microwatts per centimeter squared or 0.1 microwatts per meter squared, which are all very different measurements.
Okay, this is a quick summary of what we have learned so far about how to use the Acoustimeter to measure radio frequency fields. Turning on the meter is simple. If you're a beginner, I recommend that you mostly work with peak measurements. There's two types of measurements the meter makes, peak and average. So we're looking over on the meter here on the left column of LEDs. We're looking at peak levels versus average. If you wanted to look in the display to find the level in the moment, you can see up here in this meter is reading 2.45 volts per meter as a peak right in this moment. If you wanted to know what is the highest peak that the meter has seen since it's been turned on, you would look in the parentheses in the upper left, in this case 5.29, again volts per meter. That's what we call the maximum peak. So when you start taking measurements, the easiest thing to do is begin by watching the LEDs under the peak column on the left and get some idea of generally what the levels are. Then if you want to see exactly what the measurement is, you can look in the display, and again in the upper right, that would be the peak level at the moment wherever you're holding the meter. Here you see it in this case, 2.45 volts per meter. And it's always good to put your measurements on a data sheet because you can really easily forget and confuse numbers later. I tend to use two columns. So for the radio frequencies, in the units of volts per meter, I tend to make one column for typical peak, we call it, and another column for maximum peak. The typical peak is what I would call the typical measurements that I'm measuring, for instance, around the room or in the chair of your computer or on the couch where you watch TV. As you move the meter around, what are the normal measurements you're getting? Sometimes you'll get higher measurements and lower measurements. There might be high spikes. We're just looking, what's the typical level you're getting? That versus the maximum peak, where what is the highest peak level that was measured during that time period? If you want to find the maximum peak, You can see that in the upper left-hand corner of the display in the parentheses. And basically that'll show you the strongest peak that's been measured since the meter was last turned on. Again, this is called the maximum peak, or sometimes peak hold. And here you can see on this case, it's 5.29 volts per meter is the measurement of the maximum peak since the meter was turned on. And I would write that under the maximum peak column on my data sheet. I would write 5.29 in this case if I was entering that onto the data sheet. For instance, on this sheet where we have the master bedroom, the maximum peak we had was 0.03, a fairly low level. Another case in the family room, we had a maximum of 0.32 volts per meter. So I'd write that in there. Even though the typical level in the family room is normally much smaller, very low, 0.02, this shows that at some time, or fairly frequently, we don't know, but at some point, there was a higher peak measurement gained, and that was the maximum, and we record that. That can be very helpful later. And if you want to take another maximum peak, for instance, you've done the maximum peak of your bedroom, and now you want to do one in your living room, all you need to do is turn the meter off and then on again, and it'll reset to start with a new maximum peak. And finally, one of the most helpful features of this meter is the audio function. There's a volume control on the right side of the meter here. And you can turn that up or down, and basically that will take some of the digital modulated frequencies, electronically turn them into a sound that you can hear. And that's very helpful because you'll hear the distinctive sounds associated with the different kinds of radio frequency sources. So you can learn to tell the difference between a cell tower, from a smart meter, from a decked cordless phone, from a Wi-Fi router, and that can be really helpful to help you determine sources. And also very helpful, for instance, if you have a particular sound like a jit kind of thing, you suspect it's the router, a Wi-Fi router, say, unplug the router and that distinctive sound all of a sudden disappears simultaneously. You've just confirmed with the audio function that that was that particular source. Very helpful.
How to find and determine the sources of the radio frequency fields. Perhaps this is the most important reason that you're using an acoustimeter is not only what is the strength of the fields around you, but what are the sources, because perhaps there's something you can do about it. Perhaps there's something in your own environment that you can turn off or shield or do something about. This meter is really helpful for finding sources. There's a couple ways that you can use the meter to zero in on the source. One will be looking at the strength of the field, how many LEDs are lit up. Another will be using that sound function, which I'm going to turn on now. I can already tell there's some sort of source going on in here right now. And so not only do we have the yellow LED lit up here at around 0.1 volts per meter, but we've got a sound going on there, kind of a beacon rate like for a Wi-Fi router. So I'm already suspecting a Wi-Fi router. And the third thing is we can confirm what a source is. If it's something in our own environment, we can unplug it, turn off the power, something like that, and see the field, see the sound go away and the numbers go down, and we can confirm that that's the source. So we want to find out what's the source in here. Right now, earlier, we were getting pretty much a level of less than 0.02 volts per meter, and now we're a pretty consistent 0.10 volts per meter. I start to get concerned about that kind of number. I'm going to take it around a little bit. So the first thing I'm looking at is these LEDs, and I mostly have green, yellow. The LEDs are helpful. You don't have to follow these numbers so much. You can just use the LEDs. And I'm wondering, oh, could this source be back here somewhere? I'm still in the range of 0.1 volts per meter on this peak column. 0.1 volts per meter here. Even a little less here, about the same. Oh, starting to get a little higher and a little more sound on the meter. And I'm starting to get a little more on the average column too. And now I'm in some red over here, and it's going down again. So I can already guess as I get higher fields here, it might be related to this computer setup. I take it closer to the computer, and it's going higher. And you might already have some suspicions. I see I'm getting the highest right down here, and lo and behold, here's probably our source. There's just a little bit of a very small little Wi-Fi router device right here, extends Wi-Fi. And one of the things I've seen very high, so when I take it up close, I have very high numbers. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this router farther away, move it away, and I see the numbers go down. So you can see those red and orange lights. I'm going to take it closer. Oops, let's get a little closer and see the numbers go up and down. That's telling me that it's probably this little router device. But the final thing is to unplug it. I'm going to do that with one hand here and watch the LEDs if you can see that. And I just turned it off and the LEDs went away and that chop 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 sound went away. So I've just confirmed that that source of that 0.10 that we were having earlier, which is now down to less than 0.02, was from that little wireless device over here, which I had unplugged now. So we've found it by zeroing in on the strong fields and the stronger sound, and then confirmed that the fields went away and the sound went away when we unplugged it. You can do something like this for a lot of sources. Decked phones, cordless phones. A lot of times people think they've turned off everything and they don't realize that they have wireless in the TV system. They maybe have, or they have a wireless gateway, even though they have their computer plugged in directly and their TVs with cables, that there might be a wireless gateway from their cable company or their telephone company. So you can use your meter to find all those things, and it'll be surprising. You might have things in your house that have to do with safety. You might have sensors on the windows for the alarm system. There's all kinds of things. A baby monitor for monitoring your child. All those things can create fields. So you really want to scope around with your meter to find what they are. Another thing that you can do is, if you're wondering what's from your house or what's from the outside of your house, turn off all your devices that you know about, then also turn off the power to your house completely, which pretty much turns off all the various devices and the Wi-Fi routers and the gateway, electricity for the cable gateway or the phone company gateway that brings in your internet and phone and TV. When all those things go off, typically all the sources that are in your house, all those radio frequency sources of yours go away, and what you're left with is what's coming in from the neighborhood around you. You can also use this to see what's happening with your smart meter. You take the meter right up to the smart meter. There's different smart meters out there, but the typical one will emit a pulse. It'll seem sort of random, or even like popcorn popping when it happens. And all of a sudden there'll be some kind of signal, and when you have your meter close, it'll be obvious that it's the meter because you've got it so close. And that's another way to see how much your smart meter is emitting. Maybe some smart meters I'll see like every 5 seconds almost there's some kind of pulse on this meter you'll pick up. In some cases in the country I've seen smart meters that in a whole hour there's not even one pulse. It's not a very busy network. So there's different ways it can work, and this meter can help you track that down. When to use average versus peak measurements. You wouldn't be surprised if you're a little confused by the term peak and average and seeing two different kinds of measurements on this meter. In the last section we talked about peak measurements actually. Everything so far we've been pretty much talking about peak measurements. So for instance, on the data form here, where we have two columns over here, volts per meter, this is both peak measurements. So in the master bedroom we had 0.02, less than 0.02 for the peak that we were leveling, that we were measuring in the moment with the meter. That's typically what we saw. That's why I call it typical. And then there was a peak, the highest peak that we got, which was the maximum peak. That was 0.03. So I know it's a little confusing, but basically these are both peak measurements. It's a peak in the moment, and then what was the highest peak in the moment that we found. That's different now than average. Average average on this meter is kind of what it says, in that it takes the measurements over a certain period of time, which is actually a very small part of time, still less than a second, but it's a fairly long period of time for these radio frequencies, the way they're turned on and off, and it averages it for that time. So when you have peak levels, you can have a high level and then it can be off, and then a high level and then off, and the average will typically be less than, because you have the high and then nothing, and when you average that out, you get to a lower number. So that's like, you might remember earlier you were seeing a higher number when we had the router on the peak LEDs than you were seeing over here on the average LEDs. So what will happen is, in most cases, we want peak numbers, because peak is probably more closely related to the health effects that we see. Average is more related to the amount of energy in there averaged over time. That number is the kind of number that's used for the standards, the safety standards, like the FCC standards in the United States, which says you can only have so much radio frequency exposure. That is an average level of energy, because the average has more to do with how much power and energy is in that field total over time, and that has to do with how much it can heat up your body. For instance, cell phones are partly regulated by what they call the SAR, the SAR values, and that has to do with the heating of the body, especially in your head, as a result of the field. But most of the health effects that are being shown in the studies are way below these thermal limits, they call it, these thermal levels where you have heating effects. It's more of an interference type of effect. So the peak is probably more important for health issues, because we're starting to look at health effects from radio frequency fields that are related to interference rather than heating. But anyways, this meter has this average on it. Typically, you're not going to look at the average number, but it's helpful for a couple things. One is, when you have a high peak level but a relatively low average level, that tells you very likely it's a digital field, and it's usually like one thing, like a router or a cell phone. When you have both of them high, like you have the peak high and the average high, when those are both high, typically that's, when they're very similar, typically that's going to be more of what we call an analog source, not a digital. And it's going to typically be something more like a cell tower. Even though a cell tower is digital, there are so many signals happening all at the same time that it kind of fills up the time space, and the average and the peak are fairly similar for a cell tower. Whereas something like a router, it can be quite different, and cell phones often amazingly different. You can have sometimes 100 or 1,000 times more on this peak level than you have on the average level. So again, most of the time we're going to ignore the average. So most of the time we're not going to pay too much attention to this right column. And also on the display up here, the lower part of the display where it says average, and then right now it says 1 microwatt per meter squared. In most cases we're just going to ignore that. And one of the sort of interesting things about this meter that makes it a little complicated is they even use different units of measure for the radio frequency. In the peak mode they use volts per meter. In the average mode they use microwatts per meter squared, the typical European unit for measuring radio frequencies. So that doesn't have to be that way, it's just something the meter does, and sorry if that confuses you, but basically the easiest thing is just pretty much ignore the average numbers and look for the peak. What kinds of EMFs are detected, and how to convert the units of measure? We're going to get a little more technical than we have been, perhaps. And one of the important things about using any kind of meter is that no meter is perfect. And what does a meter pick up and what does it miss? So right on the meter it'll say at the bottom, you'll notice your meter will say 200 megahertz to 8 gigahertz. That's the frequency range that this picks up. So it means that all of these radio frequencies that are within that frequency range, and that's most of it, that's most of the digital things that we have in the modern world now, probably 90% of it, are in that range. But there's a few things that aren't in that range. You want to be aware of that. Above 8 gigahertz, you get into some of the satellite frequencies. Often between satellites, but some things with Earth too. There's less, the fields aren't usually that strong, but you do have these microwaves, they're called, in the upper part of the radio frequency band. This meter will not pick up all of those things. Pretty much there's no amateur meter, even the professional meters typically don't pick up things over 8 gigahertz without getting special meters for that. And then at the other end, 200 megahertz, that's an interesting point. What it means is it'll pick up everything above 200 megahertz, which is most wireless, digital, Wi-Fi, cell phones, cell towers, cordless phones, baby monitors, all of those things, even most of the emergency, fire, police, a lot of that, and some of the amateur radio frequencies. But below that 200 megahertz, you will not pick up AM radio stations, FM radio stations, and TV channels from 1 through 11. So when you get to channel 12, you're starting to get into the range of this meter over 200 megahertz, but below that, you're missing some of the TV. So basically, radio, AM, FM radio, and TV, and some amateur radio and some other things are being missed by this kind of meter. There's no meter that picks it all up. This is actually a pretty good range for meters. If you wanted to pick up AM radio stations and FM radio stations, those towers, those kind of things, you need a different meter for that. We do rent a meter for that purpose, but typically we don't measure that. Those are mostly analog radio frequencies versus the digital radio frequencies. The digital are the ones that are more, seem to, still anecdotal, and the studies haven't maybe completely defined this yet, but it appears that the digital signals are more trouble for our body than the analog signals. So anyways, that's what we're usually focused on for health, is this range that this meter picks up is a pretty good range, probably getting 90% of the things out there. Another thing to be aware of with a meter like this is that sound function, even though it picks up a lot of things, depending on how the radio frequency is modulated, this meter may not pick that up. So you can't count on the sound function to necessarily pick up every field out there, even in the frequency range that this meter has of 200 megahertz to 8 gigahertz. There are some radio frequencies that will not show up on the sound function. So just be aware that the sound function is a tool, but it's by no means the final say that there's about the fields. It's just an approximating tool that really helps you see the different kinds of sources out there and help you see that when they're eliminated. Most of the digital frequencies used these days do show up on the sound function of this kind of meter. And then there's the units of measure. So this meter is a little unusual in that it's using measurements of volts per meter for the peak levels. What we're usually wanting to measure the most for radio frequencies. There are different measurement units that could be used. We could have just as well have used microwatts per meter squared, which is a typical unit for measuring exposures, human exposures in Europe. Or in the United States and Canada, we typically use microwatts per centimeter squared as compared to per meter squared, which is Europe. Per centimeter squared is the typical US unit expressed. So it can be a little confusing if just make sure when you talk to other people or to other testers that you're sure what units you're using. And the meter already has a little interesting thing here to help you if you're trying to convert units. The volts per meter over here on the left, and then the microwatts per meter squared on the right. If the way they've done this meter is, if you went across from this 6 volts per meter and went across to the top over here where it says 100,000 microwatts per meter squared, those are essentially equivalent. Those are pretty close to a equivalent 6 volts per meter comes out to 100,000 microwatts per meter squared, European units. So on the other end, this 0.02 down here is equivalent to 1 microwatt per meter squared. So already you can use the face of your meter for some converting units from volts per meter to microwatts per meter squared. You can also, we have instructions about how to use the meter, written instructions, and at the back of that there's a conversion chart. See if we can get that into focus here. And this can be very helpful. So here you're going to see, here's different kinds. Let's use an example. In this room I measured up to 0.03 microwatts. I'm sorry. I'm here with volts per meter with the Acoustimeter on the peak. Looking at peak measurements, I measured up to 0.03 microwatts. I'm sorry, saying that again. 0.03 volts per meter. So you can see how getting these units right can really stumble around that. In this room earlier, when we had the router off, I measured up to 0.03 volts per meter on the meter. Now, I can look across here. That's equivalent to 30 millivolts per meter, another way to give the same measurement. It's equivalent to 0.00024 microwatts per centimeter squared. That's the American units. That same 0.03 is equivalent to 2.4 microwatts per meter squared. That's the European units. And that can also be expressed as 0.0024 milliwatts per meter squared, another way to say the same European units. So you can see right here there's 5 different kinds of units of measure. So you just have to make sure what you're doing. You can use this chart to help you convert from the volts per meter to some of the other measurements. You can also go online, and there's conversion websites where you can basically type in your volts per meter and you can come out with a good translation into the equivalent measurement number in another unit that you choose. What level is safe, and what do these numbers mean? Maybe this is the most controversial aspect of measuring radio frequency fields in any EMFs, is what do these numbers mean? Is this a good number or a bad number? Is this a safe level or an unsafe level? I don't know that I could say for anybody what's safe or unsafe. There's a lot of different opinions on that, and I have in our instructions for the meter, and you can find this on my website, emfcenter.com. We'll always have the current levels that we're looking at for safety levels from several sources. Just looking at these instructions here for the Acoustimeter, back on this last page again, where we have this conversion chart, at the bottom of the conversion chart, I have RF safety levels for consideration. These are some suggestions you might go with. Probably the one that I put a lot of validity in is the Bio-Initiative report. The more recent report, as of the time of this filming, was the Bio-Initiative 2012 update. So on this chart we have the Bio-Initiative recommendation. What they say is the maximum we should have. This is their safety level that they recommend. They've recommended in American units 0.0003, get in the focus here, microwatts per centimeter squared. If you're wondering what that means for the Acoustimeter, we can go over here to the volts per meter column on the left, and that's equivalent to 0.034 volts per meter. So when you're using the Acoustimeter, we're on the left for peak at the very bottom LED here, 0.02, the second LED, 0.03. If you have one of these these LEDs lit up or no LEDs lit up, you're within that safety standard that's recommended by the Bio-Initiative report. So some people will use that meter with that safety level in mind and just make sure that where they sleep and spend the most time, that you have 0.03 or less, these lower 2 LEDs are lit up, and no more than that. Once you get over 0.03, like to the 0.05 LED, then you're starting to get into levels that are above the recommendations of the Bio-Initiative 2012 report. Now there's different opinions on what is healthy there. I'm not going to go into that here, partly because that can change over time as more studies come in. For instance, with the Bio-Initiative report, there in 2007 they recommended a level of 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared, 0.1, and then in 2012, because of over 1,000 new studies showing effects at low levels, they went from that 0.1 to recommend 0.0003. So you can use information like this. You can go to our website, emfcenter.com, and look at our current safety guidelines. And again, it's up to you to decide what level is okay. Another thing, pretty much at this time, the official safety limits set by the government and safety organizations, like in the United States, the FCC safety limit, to give you an idea how this works. The level that's allowed for a lot of these radio frequencies is 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. So even, and the Bio-Initiative report is saying 0.0003 as the limit. So you can see quite the difference. If you were just wondering, one of the quick things at this time, the lowest level that's been linked to cancer, 0.02 microwatts per centimeter squared. And that might change as time goes on. So I always recommend you check with our website to see what the current safety recommendations are.